background is in industrial organizational psychology, and I've been in the talent assessment world for a number of years now. In one of my previous roles, I served as an external consultant, so I was working with a number of different vendors and hundreds of different assessment options. So I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the assessment space. Of course, there's thousands of assessments out there, so you never know them all. But as Andy mentioned, our goal today is really kind of providing that high-level summary of what are the different options and what are the different types of leadership assessments that are available.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Chrissy. Looking forward to this today. I've been in the assessment industry for many, many years, and I work for one of the major global companies out there. So my view on assessments and going not only viewing my previous companies but my competitors, I've had a chance to really look at a lot of them, look at the effectiveness or in many cases the ineffectiveness of assessments. However, with regard to leadership, I feel it's a very essential area that we need to cover. It's kind of like in sports. You don't know what your players are going to do if you don't see them perform a little bit. So whether, depending upon which type of assessment you utilize, it's going to give you kind of a cursory overview of maybe what their potential is, or it's going to be a very deep dive into what they can do. But this overall is going to help your company when it comes to possibly selecting, developing, identifying your high potentials, identifying people for succession planning. So they are tools that are going to make your life a little bit easier. They are tools that are going to provide you with insight. So today during our webinar, the things we're going to cover, number one, we're really going to look at the main categories of leadership assessments. We want to do a little comparing and contrasting the advantages, disadvantages of each. And then obviously we want to get into the assessment center's ROI to other popular options that are available out there. All assessments are not created equal. There are a lot of similarities. There's a lot of, I think, probably I think the perception on some assessments might be incorrect depending upon what your background is. There's a lot of material that you hear things about it, you learn things about it from different people, but it may not do what you hope it will do. So with that in mind, I really we're going to be moving into a discussion on all this, and at this point I think I'll go. Christy, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. Thank you, Andy, for the introduction.
The next slide we talked about once again kind of gets into really why use leadership assessments, and we're going to get into the area of hiring and selection, development, promotion, succession planning. These once again are areas that assessments can really be a valuable tool for you.
Great. Thank you, Andy. So I included this as the first slide. I'm sure we all know why we use leadership assessments, but I included this as the first slide because the purpose really does matter. So a tool is created for a specific purpose. It can be created for multiple purposes, but there's always that forethought when an assessment tool is being developed of what is this going to be used for. And that forethought determines how that tool is developed and then how it is validated, what type of research is done. And it's really important to keep in mind what was the intention of this tool, because a tool can be highly valid for use in development, but completely not validated at all to be used in hiring and selection. So the purpose matters, and we'll talk about that as we go through some of these categories of leadership assessments as well. So we'll go through 7 main categories, and as Andy mentioned, we have quite a bit of content, so we'll provide really a general overview of these different categories, keeping in mind that our goal is to provide this high-level summary, so we've been forced to make some generalizations within these categories. Certainly there's subtle differences and maybe even big differences of assessment providers and assessment tools within each of these categories, but the goal is really, again, to provide that high-level overview of what are the different options available. And then we'll have 7 different criteria, comparison criteria that we'll talk through. So the first one is what is measured. Are we measuring personality? Are we measuring skills? Are we measuring cognitive ability? So we'll talk through what is intended to be measured in the different categories of assessments, as well as the intended use. So is this hiring, is this selection, promotion, or whatnot? The ability to cheat, this comes up often with clients that I've worked with. Can the candidate cheat, or can someone else kind of cheat or fake the assessment? So we'll talk through a little bit about what is the ability to cheat with each of these different categories. And then related to that is the ability to eliminate biases. So biases can come in a number of different forms. These can be our self-biases, things that an inaccurate view of ourselves or biases that we have of ourselves. And this can also come from others. So others' biases of us that are going to impact the assessment results. We'll talk about validity. So validity is an important component, probably one of the most important components. And this is essentially looking at how accurate is this tool in measuring what it says to measure. So that's why we'll talk through what is it intended to measure, what is the intended use, because validity is always how accurate is the tool, is the assessment in measuring what it says it does. Then of course cost is another big factor, so we'll talk through that at a high level and then offer a high level pros and cons of each of the different comparison categories. So we'll start with personality tests. There's a number of different examples that fall into this category. For example, Myers-Briggs, DISC, the Hogan HPI are all examples of personality tests. And personality tests are really intended to predict job performance on the assumption that people will generally behave in the same way based on their personality tendencies, and that this is relatively consistent across time and situations. So the first thing to note here is this is a pretty large assumption. Personality certainly we do have natural tendencies in the way that we present or the way that we behave in situations, but this can vary from situation to situation or depending on our mood for that day. If we're having a really tough day, we might resort to some of the tendencies that we've tried to hinder in the past, but when we're running out of steam, we just don't have the ability to hinder that. So the assumption that personality is always going to result in the same behaviors is a relatively big assumption that's made in the use of personality testing. So the intended use can vary. Generally, a lot of personality assessments are intended to be used in selection as well as development or promotion context, but again, that varies by the provider. The ability to cheat a personality test is pretty high. So this can be based on both of a lack of self-awareness, so maybe you're not trying to distort how you view yourself, but you just don't view yourself as others do, or you could be intentionally trying to distort how you present yourself. This is what we call social desirability, or responding the way we think others want us to respond. And some personality tools have lie scales or social desirability scales embedded to detect this. But if it is detected, I've been in this situation with a number of different clients, it's difficult to determine what to do. So someone's not being accurate in how they present themselves, but what does that mean in terms of the decision you're going to make? So the ability to eliminate biases, I said some, not all. So of course it eliminates some of the biases that we get from other individuals when individuals are rating us, but it doesn't eliminate the self-biases that we have. The validity of personality assessments tends to be fairly low. So personality tests are considered one of the lowest predictors of performance on a job. So they tend to have the lowest validity, but they also tend to have the lowest cost. So they tend to be very low-cost solutions. For that reason, really one of the pros of personality tests is that they are best utilized in high-volume, lower-level positions because they do have that low cost and they do have some validity. The cons of personality tests, again, is the small ROI. Even though you have a small investment on personality tests, you're also, due to the low validity, you're not getting a whole lot out of that as well. And then finally, many of them lack actionable feedback. So just because for example, that you're not a very caring person, what does that actually mean for you? We know that personality is relatively stable, so people aren't going to really have the ability to modify their personality per se, but it's more important that we let people know how does this personality interact with your behaviors, and oftentimes that's not fully presented in a personality-only assessment. Now we'll go to the situation. Yes.
Yeah, Chrissy, I wanted just to jump in here, and this kind of applies to all the ability to cheat. This question comes up a lot from my clients. You know, Andy, how do I know my employee, my candidate is not going to cheat on the assessment? And, you know, number one, you never know if they're going to or not. You just don't know. But one of the things to keep in mind, why would somebody cheat? Well, a lot of times when you're taking these questionnaires, it's because you're trying to get a higher level position, or you're just trying to get a position in general. So people will try to answer the questions, in many cases, the way they think you want them answered, not based upon what their background is, their personality is, or what they really feel or think, but on where they think or how they think you want them to answer it. And this is driven by the desire, number one, if it's for a higher level position, the prestige of a higher job, of a better title, prestige, and more money, the prestige of making more money. So it's one of those things to keep in mind. And I know when I've counseled folks who are getting ready to take an assessment, I'm like, look, be honest. Be honest, because if you get into a job that is that you don't match up with, it's going to mean disaster down the road. It's going to mean potentially some tough times and stress. So that's kind of getting into the ability to cheat, why it can potentially happen. So I just wanted to throw that in. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. So the next category we'll discuss is the situational judgment tests. And these are intended to measure really what a person would do in a hypothetical situation. So there's a number of different providers for situational judgment tests. CEB offers a variety of these. Basically, they give a participant a hypothetical scenario. Sometimes this might be a video, sometimes this might be a text-based scenario, and they ask the person, in this situation, what would you do, A, B, C, or D? They're often intended to be used across a variety of contexts, so selection, development, succession planning, promotion. But the ability to cheat is high. So you are essentially measuring someone's knowledge of what is the best thing to do in this situation, rather than what they would actually do in that situation. So similar to personality tests, it eliminates some biases, but not all. We still have the social desirability or the ability of the candidate to present themselves more favorably, because we're not actually measuring what it is they do in that situation. We're asking them what they would do. The validity tends to be moderate, so a little bit higher than personality, mainly because it is focused on the behavioral context and actual behaviors in a situation. The cost also tends to be fairly low for these tools, but that does vary by provider. And so similar to personality, these are really best utilized in high volume, lower level positions. But the cons of this is they're generally not very predictive of future performance. If you've ever been asked to take one of these, I know when I've had to take these in the past, the situation that's presented to me, well, I wouldn't do A, B, C, or D. I'd probably do a combination of A and B, and then maybe something else that's not provided in those options. So that's one of the fallacies, or one of the problems with multiple choice assessments in general, is that we, as test developers, we try to determine what it is people would answer and what are the best responses, but of course we can't capture everyone's responses with those. So the forced choice format or the multiple choice format, where we really impose these response options on people, tends to inhibit or prohibit the ability of the assessment tool to really predict future performance. Next, we return to cognitive ability tests. So these are more commonly known as intelligence tests, or formerly known as intelligence tests. And these are a really popular option for talent assessment more generally, particularly in leadership. So what is measured, this really varies by the different providers. Sometimes it's what we call overall intelligence. Sometimes it's facets of intelligence. So maybe that's processing speed or memory, spatial reasoning. There's a number of different facets of intelligence that can be measured. Oftentimes they're used in selection, development, succession planning, and most people are familiar with the Wonderlic. It's one of the popular tools because it's been used by the NFL. So it was really made popular by the NFL and used in scouting and drafts. But there's a number of other options out there. For example, the Watson-Glaser, the Ray-Brins matrices are all considered cognitive ability tests. So the ability to cheat is generally low, assuming that it is proctored, because there is a right and wrong answer for many of these assessments. It becomes really important to proctor this. You can't just send the candidate a link or the employee a link and say, complete this at your convenience. Generally with cognitive ability tests, they must be proctored in a situation where the individual isn't able to use outside resources to help them in that test. They're very good at eliminating biases, with the caveat of adverse impact, which I'll get at in a minute, but they're very good at eliminating self-biases, the biases of others. The validity tends to be pretty moderate to high, particularly, or it is moderate to high for jobs that require higher cognitive functioning, such as leadership positions. The cost can be low to moderate depending on the tool. In general, they tend to be a good predictor of performance for positions that require higher levels of cognitive functioning. But the cons, one is it's not very actionable. So similar to personality, cognitive ability is considered relatively stable. So it's not necessarily helpful feedback to let someone know that they're low on cognitive ability. There's not a lot that person can do about it. And it's not like personality where you can modify really your personality to fit in different situations. It's kind of one of those things you have or you don't. So it tends not to be very actionable. And then the main con of cognitive ability tests traditionally has been adverse impact concerns. So cognitive ability tests tend to demonstrate more adverse impact or discrimination against protected groups that leads to a different rate of selection for different groups. And this has been one of the issues with cognitive ability tests for a long time. So it becomes really important for the organization to monitor this, to really track this, and to monitor the rate of selection and how different groups are performing if a cognitive ability is used. Now I'll turn to test batteries. So this category is really large. Test batteries are essentially a combination of multiple types of assessments, oftentimes multiple choice assessments, that are bundled into a single test. So there's lots of variability in here, but some examples would be, for example, profiles, the Korn Ferry Leadership Architect, or the VIA Edge are all considered a test battery. And so they might include components of personality, maybe cognitive ability, maybe some situational judgment tests. Some even include self-report biographical data. So what is your experience doing this task? Or what is your tenure in this type of position? Oftentimes they're used across a variety of talent management contexts, selection, development, succession planning. And the ability to cheat is really based on the makeup of the tests within the battery. So for example, like we mentioned, it's fairly high for personality, fairly low for cognitive ability. So if the battery has a blend of both, then the ability to cheat would be high for some areas and low for others. Similar to the other tools we've discussed, it eliminates some biases, but not all. So some of the self-biases are still present, but it certainly does eliminate some of the biases of others. The validity tends to be low to moderate, depending on the makeup of the assessments that are provided or the tests that are included in that battery. And likewise, the cost tends to be low to moderate. Oftentimes, I've had clients that really like to use test batteries because it provides a holistic view of the participant. So it's not only a snapshot into their personality or their cognitive ability, maybe you have some situational judgment assessment in there as well. So it provides a multifaceted view of that individual. But the cons, if there's a cognitive ability component, again, the adverse impact is a concern, and then the lack of actionable feedback. Because everything is self-report, everything is multiple choice, it becomes difficult to provide actionable feedback on skills or behaviors because, again, you have to make that leap from personality to behaviors or cognitive ability to performance. Then we'll move to one of the most popular options, I would say, in talent management more generally, and it's true for leadership assessment as well, which is interviewing. So interviewing can cover a wide range of competencies, and they're used across selection and promotion succession planning, not as often in development decisions or context. And there's really 2 or 4 different types of interviewing. So there's what we call structured and unstructured. Structured is when you have a list of questions and you ask that of every person that you talk to. Unstructured is when you maybe make up the questions as you go based on what the person has said previously. or you have a different set of questions for different candidates, so it's far less standardized. And then there's what we call behavioral versus non-behavioral. So behavioral is really asking about a specific behavior and an example of that behavior. For example, tell me about a time when you were responsible for managing a large project. What were the challenges you faced and how did you overcome those? So I'm asking about a very specific instance in the past that this person should be reporting about. Whereas non-behavioral would be something like, tell me about the best way to manage a project. Tell me about your views on the best way to manage a large-scale project. So there we're not necessarily asking for specific examples. We're just kind of asking more generally about this individual's views on project management. So the ability to cheat varies from the different types of solution. It's moderate for behavioral interviewing. I would say low to moderate for behavioral interviewing. Individuals, of course, are asked to think on their feet, so it's difficult for people to provide untruthful answers in that context, but they can inflate kind of the examples that they were already planning to present or the examples that they think of on the spot, whereas it tends to be pretty high for non-behavioral interviews. Eliminates biases, no. So here we have self-biases that come into play as well as a lot of interviewer biases. So we know that interviewing is difficult, rating other people's behavior is difficult, and that there's a lot of biases involved in that process, particularly with interviews, particularly if they're unstructured and non-behavioral. So the validity tends to be pretty low for the unstructured and non-behavioral interviews, and it tends to be moderate for structured and behavioral interviews. And the cost can really vary. Most of the cost here is associated with the time of the interviewers. Of course, time to develop the questions as well, but when we think about the cost of the interviewers' time, say we have 5 senior leaders that are interviewing 10 of our participants, well, that time adds up quite quickly. So the pros, structured behavioral interviewing is a good approach. It is the best approach in terms of interviewing. The cons for all of the method is that it really does focus on past performance. So we're asking people to report on situations in the past, which may or may not be reflective of what we're going to be asking them to do in the future. Of course, the time involved, this is one of the biggest things that clients come to me with if they're looking to move away from interviews, is that they just don't have the time for their senior leaders or their key stakeholders to be conducting all of these interviews. And then finally, the biases, the interviewer biases that are involved in this process. Now we're moving to 360 and performance reviews, and I've included these. These aren't necessarily an assessment per se. I mean, they are in the sense that we're intending to measure someone and evaluate them. But I've included them because they are a popular tool in terms of leadership assessment. So this is probably one of the most commonly used tools for how we assess leaders. So what is measured? The competency, the goal is to measure competencies, and the competencies that are measured can vary. But research suggests that really what we're more measuring is the subjective opinions of others, that we're not doing a great job of measuring competencies with this particular approach. They're most often used in development or succession planning. The ability to cheat, I say high here, it's pretty low for the individual that's being evaluated, but it's very high for respondents. So if I'm a supervisor and I have one employee that is my favorite employee, maybe that's because of my personal relationship, maybe it's because of the professional competence, but there's a high ability for me to be able to cheat this method to inflate my responses and present the candidate more favorably than perhaps they are. As a result of the biases that are involved in this, the validity tends to be pretty low. In fact, a lot of research suggests that 360s and performance reviews actually tell us more about the person that is making the ratings than the person that's being measured. And so when we're thinking about leadership assessment, of course, that's the opposite of what we want. That's not what we're trying to measure, resulting in a fairly low validity. The cost here is often, again, associated with time, and this tends to be moderate to high, depending on how many raters are involved and what level we're talking about. At higher level positions are certainly more costly due to the higher salaries associated with those raters. The pros can be, oftentimes in the context of development, if the ratings are accurate, it can be helpful for increasing self-awareness of how others perceive that individual. And I would say that's probably one of the main pros of the 360 approach or performance reviews. The cons are, of course, that, again, we're focusing on past performance, the inaccuracy of them, the biases, the politics that are often involved in 360 or performance reviews makes it a very, it makes it an inaccurate view oftentimes of the candidate, which can do more harm than good. And then finally, the last category we'll cover is assessment centers. So assessment centers, what is measured, the competencies really vary, but the focus is always on skills. So actual observation of skills in a real-life situation to measure behavioral competencies or to provide proficiency in regards to those competencies. The intended use can vary across providers. Most are developed for selection, development, and succession planning. The ability to cheat is very low, similar to cognitive ability. Either you have the skill or you don't. And if you don't have it, then it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to display it. So the ability to cheat is low, and elimination of biases is rather high. So although there are raters involved, so someone that's observing this individual's behaviors, the raters are third-party assessors. They tend to be individuals that have a background in behavioral observation and behavioral psychology, and they're really trained very thoroughly to do just this task. And of course, they have no vested interest in the participant or the company. They are, by all means, objective and third party. So a lot of those biases are really eliminated. Due to the focus, the elimination of biases and the focus on behaviors, we tend to see a really high validity for assessment centers. However, that also comes with a high cost. So there are live humans involved in this, both in terms of conducting role plays as well as making ratings, and that human component comes with a much higher cost as compared to many of the other tools we've discussed. So the pros, it tends to be a great predictor. There are multiple exercises, so it gives you a view of the candidate, how they behave, what their skill set is across multiple different contexts. And participants tend to report these are much more fun and engaging than answering a multiple choice assessment. The main cons are the time involved, so it tends to take more time to complete an assessment center than it would a multiple choice assessment, and then again the cost. So there's virtual assessment centers and in-person assessment centers. The in-person methods are very costly due to the travel components and all of the time associated with that. The virtual assessment centers are much cheaper as compared, or much less expensive as compared to the face-to-face or in-person methods, but still much more costly as compared to a lot of the other assessment tools we've discussed. So now I'm going to turn to talking about ROI. So there was a 2016 Global Assessment Survey that suggested assessment centers are really the fastest growing assessment tool for leadership development. And in reality, the assessment centers were largely created for that specific purpose. So keeping that in mind, that this is one of the main used tools in leadership assessment, we'll do some ROI analysis with assessment centers and a couple other popular approaches to determine really, does this high cost, is it worth it? Is it worth investing so much in assessment centers? So the first ROI analysis we have here, this is versus doing nothing, so using absolutely no leadership assessment tool whatsoever. And this comes from some of our internal research with one of our clients, Denver Public Schools. They had a group where they used our virtual assessment center and a group where they used no leadership assessment. And then we looked at the amount of turnover between those two groups. And what we found is that though, of course, the investment was much higher, they invested about $150,000 into the virtual assessment centers for their leaders. And then in the do nothing group, of course, they invested nothing. But the rate at which they were able to retain employees actually suggests that they experienced about an 1,800% ROI or 1,900% ROI because of that reduction in turnover by using a leadership development tool that really allowed them to both engage their employees and their leaders and develop them in the process. The next ROI analysis here looks at personality tests. So personality tests, typically we're looking at about an investment of, on the upper end, about $150 per person. On the lower end, probably about $50 per person. With the assessment center, we'd be investing about $550 per person. However, based on the validity of these different tools, what we see is we tend to see about, at best, a 9% increase in productivity based on the personality test, whereas in assessment center, we tend to see about a 25% increase in productivity. So again, though the initial investment was much higher, the actual return on that investment is about 340% in this specific case. Now we'll turn to 360 and 360-degree feedback and performance reviews. So the cost for the 360-degree feedback performance reviews, this can really vary. Some research has suggested $250 per employee when taking into account the time to compile ratings and submit ratings and sit down and meet with the employee. Other estimates have suggested upwards of $3,000 per employee. So we used a conservative estimate here of $250 per employee. And the research suggests that using 360s or performance reviews for promotion, about 50% of newly promoted leaders succeed, or 50% fail, depending on how you want to look at that. Whereas with the assessment center approach, of course, the investment is slightly higher here, but the research suggests, and this comes again from some of our internal research with clients using our virtual assessment centers, that about 80% of newly promoted leaders succeed. So when we take into account that 30%, and in this scenario, this is based on 100 managers, so this is assuming that 30 of our managers actually fail, the ROI is actually around 870%. Again, though the investment for the assessment center in this particular case would have been about $30,000 more, what we retained in potential turnover costs, or what we saved in potential turnover costs, far outweighs that initial investment that we put in. And then the last ROI analysis that I'll present here is the virtual assessment center versus the traditional assessment center. So the research suggests that they're equally valid approaches. Our internal research suggests that our virtual assessment centers might be slightly stronger in terms of the validity, so we might have a higher percentage of success. But to be conservative, we're assuming they're equally effective methods, so they're both going to result in that 25% increase in productivity. But as you can see here, the investment is very different. So we're talking about $10,000 per employee versus $550 per employee. So this is where we see the greatest ROI of the virtual assessment center, just under 4,000% due to that much lower investment and still the increased validity that we see with the assessment center approach. So the winner of the most bang for your buck, of course, is the assessment centers. And in the interest of disclosing biases, of course, we are an assessment center company. But I will mention that I work for an assessment center company because I believe in the method rather than vice versa. So there's tons of research that have suggested that assessment centers are one of the most valid tools. The biggest prohibitor of assessment centers has always been that cost and the time involved. So when we really start to look at the ROI, we can see why assessment centers are one of the fastest growing leadership assessment tools globally in 2016. So I know that went a little bit longer than I had thought, but we still have about 8 minutes or so for questions. Andy, have we had any questions come in?
Yeah, we have. We've had a few. If you have any questions, there's a little box on your screen. You can type these in, but I'll start going through the questions we've got now. The first one that came in is, how do you determine if an assessment could have an adverse impact on a protected class? So I think you need to put your legal hat on if you can for us right now.
Yeah, that is a good question, and definitely it's a legal question and it's also a scientific question. At a very high level, to determine adverse impact, it becomes important to really monitor. So to report and to monitor the demographics of participants so that you can actually analyze that information. And then look at the success rates. So how many of those candidates are getting interviews, how many of those candidates are moving on to the assessment, or how many candidates are promoted based on this assessment tool. And then with statistical analysis, you can determine is the rate of selection for these different groups equal. But the most important component, and where I see most clients that are not able to do adverse impact analysis, is just because they don't collect that data. So if you don't collect the demographic data, then of course you can't analyze how those different groups are comparing.
Okay, and their follow-up question on that was, are assessment providers required to have and to share their EEOC and OFCCP studies?
That is a good question. I don't know that it is a requirement. I mean, it's certainly a professional requirement. So within the field, I would say that's a professional requirement. I'm not sure that that's a legal requirement to share that, but I would certainly, when you're considering an assessment provider, that is the first thing I ask for, is the technical manual, the validation evidence, and any of that information should be presented within that type of manual. So I highly recommend that that's always the first place to start.
Okay. Another question we've got here is, how effective do virtual assessment centers measure group or meeting skills?
Yeah, that is a good question. So different assessment centers are, of course, run differently. With ours at Pinsight, there's a number of exercises where we assess their ability to manage a group, to delegate to groups, to interact with groups. So we are able to assess a lot of those group dynamics. We don't necessarily assess meeting skills as a specific competency. However, there are a number of other competencies we assess that would be related to that, such as communication skills or ability to plan and organize, the ability to influence others. So some of those other components that probably go into meeting skills are often assessed in virtual assessment centers and traditional assessment centers. I think we might have lost Andy, so let me see if I can read some of these questions here.
Hey, I got booted out. Did I?
Oh, you're back.
I'm back. I dialed as quick as I can. The next question that we had come in, I don't know if you jumped on to the next one, but what are you typically measuring in the virtual assessment center? And the follow-up is, what type of exercises are included in the virtual assessment center, and how long does it take to complete?
All good questions. So typically what we're measuring, the specific competencies or skills will vary across levels. So at Pinsight we have 3 different virtual assessment centers, one for manager, entry-level managers, one for mid-level leaders, and then one for senior executives. And of course the skills that are measured at those 3 levels vary. But generally we are focused on leadership skills. So we've made a lot of attempts to remove kind of the technical side of leadership and to be able to purely assess what are an individual's leadership skills. So at the lower level, it would be things like planning and organizing, the ability to delegate, communicating clearly is assessed across all levels, the ability to mentor and coach. And then at the higher level, executive level, we're looking at much more strategic skills, such as the ability to build strategic relationships or to think strategically, to build a strategic plan, and things of that nature. In terms of the exercises, again, those will vary across the 3 different levels. Generally, there's always a direct report interaction. So the nature of that interaction will vary across the levels, but there's always a live role play with a fictitious direct report in which the participant is tasked with either kind of coaching this individual on some developmental feedback or trying to retain this high-performing employee that's thinking about leaving. There's also a component of presentation skills in all of the simulations or assessment centers. So for example, at the manager level, we'll ask them to develop a project plan and then present that to their fictitious supervisor in a live video role play. At the senior level, they're asked to come up with a strategy and then present that in a more formal meeting, in a more formal presentation to their supervisor. And then the other exercises really kind of vary across the different levels. In some of them, there's what we call coworker conflict, so the ability to kind of diagnose and diffuse interpersonal issues between 2 of the individual's direct reports. In the senior level, there's some negative publicity for the company that the individual is tasked with overcoming. In some of them, there's upset customers that the individual is either asked to delegate or to address themselves. So the nature of the exercises varies across the 3 levels, but hopefully that provides a good summary. And then the last part of that question was, how long does it take to complete?
Yes.
So the virtual assessment centers that we offer are always 3 hours in length, and they have a hard stop and a hard start because there are live video role plays. So we have a team that's responsible for conducting those and scheduled at specified times. But the assessment center itself is always 3 hours in length.
Okay, great. Next question, what impact does broadband speed and reliability have on data collection?
Yeah, that's a good question. With ours, we have found that it does have an impact. So because they are live simulations or assessment centers and there's emails coming in, files being sent, video role plays that are occurring, just like with Skype, the internet connection, the broadband speed is going to impact that video connection quality. However, we have made arrangements when that quality is not very good. So we've done a lot of assessments in underdeveloped areas of the world. And so in those areas, we've used telephone, or we've come up with other methods to address that broadband issue. But certainly, for cloud-based assessment centers or online assessment centers, that internet connectivity is an important component.
Fantastic. Tom, we got one more here. Can virtual assessment centers assess more than one person simultaneously in a group setting?
They can. So with traditional assessment centers, that's really an exercise that's been used a lot, is what's called a leaders list group discussion, or even just a group discussion wherein there's a participant and then there's a bunch of what we call confederates that are interacting with that person, and we're able to assess how does this person interact within this group. I'm not aware of any virtual assessment centers that have that group component. But there, like I mentioned before, there are still a number of different group components. So we look at their ability to lead a group, to manage a group, to delegate within the group, to deal with some of the interpersonal conflicts that occur within the group. So even though they're not actually in that group context with confederates, we're still able to look at and to measure a lot of those group interactions.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, I see our time is up. Any parting comments, Christy?
You know, Andy, I think I've shared a lot in this webinar. There was a lot of content to share. And I don't know that there's really any parting comments that I have, other than if you have any questions, let me go ahead and shift forward to the next slide. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. So both Andy and myself have had quite a bit of experience in the talent assessment world, and particularly with leadership assessments, and I know I'd be happy, and I'm sure I can speak for you, Andy, when I say we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, either about the content of this webinar or about leadership assessments more generally.
Fantastic. No, I will agree with you there. You had mentioned early on that you really like the content, what we do, how we do it within Pennsite. I will say, too, that's what attracted me to Pennsite. That's what brought me over. It's kind of a brave new world out there where we've taken a traditional assessment center and we've virtualized it. We've put it online. The people who have taken the assessment feel that is one of the biggest journeys of self-help development, self-awareness that they've been through. It really gets people to recognize what they're doing it, and the millennials absolutely love it. So if there's any questions we can ask or answer for you, please shoot us an email. Please feel free to give us a call. I'd be more than happy to share what we've learned through our journey and help your companies in some decision making. So once again, thank you once again from Pennsite. We appreciate it. Everybody have a safe 4th of July weekend. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.